that brings us to you, the auxiliary emergency communicator. And again, within this program, anytime you see this AEC, that is, I think we all know from some other programs that there is another term for EC or AEC. A lot of people may know that as Assistant Emergency Coordinator under Aries or RACES type programs. That is not what that means here. This is Auxiliary Emergency Communicator. This is a broad term for any volunteer radio operator or non-paid operator that's working within your incident. And this doesn't necessarily, may not necessarily mean that it's an licensed amateur operator. It could be some other type of volunteer radio operators. You guys want to throw some out there? Some other things that are out there? React. CERT. Absolutely. There's there's license-free ways that some of those people communicate. It may be a GMRS licensee that's a member of a REACT group, maybe a CERT member. It could be any of those types of things. So all of those different types of communicators all fall under this Auxiliary Emergency Communications group. And and we were talking about REACT last night actually, and REACT in my neck of the woods is there's no such thing. It doesn't exist. But there's a lot of places where it does. Like in California and Southern California and stuff, they're huge. They've got networked repeater systems, and they train and they support events just like the amateur groups do. So we don't need to forget about all those little groups out there. So that's the reason when we talk about auxiliary communications, all of those groups kind of come under this AEC umbrella. So keep that in the back of your mind as we go through the program, that when we talk about AEC networks, AEC communicators, all those different types of things, those all are going to fall under that AEC umbrella. So when we talk about that AEC communicator, that auxiliary communicator, right now that is the unofficial ICS position that supports the operational and technical aspects of the comm unit. Within that comes a lot of responsibilities. That's going to come with not only operating the radios, that's going to be maintaining those networks quite often, those auxiliary groups, the amateur groups, all those different groups. We maintain our own equipment. We keep it running. We make sure it's working. We train with it all the time. All of those different types of things, those are all going to be responsibilities of those auxiliary communicators, as well as staffing the AEC center and making sure that auxiliary communicator performs this function and has the knowledge to perform these functions as well. Okay, continuing on, that auxiliary communicator is going to perform the auxiliary communications duties of, as we already discussed, not only operating those communications equipment, but maintaining them and keeping them optimized. And of course, any other duties or jobs that may be assigned by your upper management or that you see there that needs to be done. Have any of you guys been out on deployments? Have any of you been asked to do anything that's outside of your normal scope? It's outside of your normal scope as an amateur, things that you have done within emergency response. Have you been handed a public safety radio and say, hey, we need you to listen to this to make sure there's no emergency calls? Or we need you to sit down and be a radio operator here because this guy just had an emergency or he needs to go to the bathroom or whatever the case may be. Have any of you been put into that position? Sure, absolutely. It's going to happen. So going into this with being flexible is going to be a key factor. Also within our auxiliary emergency communications role, we're also within that unit, we're going to have our AEC manager. And this AEC manager is going to be the person that reports to the COML and manages all of those auxiliary communicators that are there working on the incident. They're going to manage the operational and technical aspects of the auxiliary communications unit. So if you think of the comm unit built out for public safety, you're going to have this whole other comm unit off to the side. So you've got the AEC manager is basically going to be like a mini COML, so to speak. Then you've got your Down below that, you may have a AEC, an operator over the technical aspects. You may have a AEC handling the operational aspects, such as you may have a traffic center set up where you're passing traffic, you're doing health and welfare, whatever the case may be, doing phone patches, who knows, sending data, whatever the case may be. You're going to have to, again, make sure that when you're working with an ICS structure, you're going to have to maintain that span of control. Just because you're auxiliary communicators doesn't mean that you get to say, oh, we're just volunteers. It doesn't matter if I have 30 people working under me. That's not going to work. It doesn't work that way. You're following within ICS and NIMS framework now. You have to follow the same rules that we do in the full-time side. So again, that AEC manager is going to supervise the operators, the technicians, and any other support personnel that you may have on that incident. And unless otherwise specified on your particular incident, overall speaking, the AEC manager is going to report to who again? The COML. Absolutely. Not to say that an incident that you go on, that the COML may not say, well, I'm going to have you report to this COMT, the Incident Communication Center Manager, whatever that COML dictates out is how you would want to operate.
Would you say that this position operates like a COMC within the, to coordinate interface with AEC networks from other organizations?
Yes, absolutely. Because, and it's good that you mentioned that, and we'll get into that a little bit later in the program. There's some sections on that. But yes, not only are you going to want to provide for your incident, you're going to want to reach out to those other groups. Do you think the COML is going to always, is every COML going to be fully versed on what the auxiliary communications unit is about, what their capabilities are, what frequencies you're on? No, most of them are not going to be. Most of them are going to come from the public safety background. They're going to have a working knowledge of their local radio system, but maybe even not to the technical detail that the COMTs do. That being said, you're going to be the one that's going to be counted on to reach out to other auxiliary groups, to those other interface areas, making sure that information is flowing to and from those groups, making sure everybody knows and everybody's on the same page as far as frequencies, all those different types of things to make sure that there is not a conflict. So yes, you're going to be kind of a mini COMC, so to speak, or reaching out to whoever that auxiliary communications person is going to be that's looking at the whole picture, maybe at the state level. Most of our states have an auxiliary communications coordinator at the state level that's looking at all those different types of things. So yes, you're going to be the one reaching out. As AEC manager, or if there's not one, it would be the AEC operator, is going to be the one that needs to reach out to them saying, hey, here's what we're doing. Here's what HF frequencies we're using, whatever the case may be, to make sure that we're not interfering with other groups. We're going to be coordinating and assisting within our EOC realm, as well as possibly within the MERS arena as well. Anybody familiar with that? With what MERS is? FEMA. Yep, that's MERS is FEMA's emergency mobile emergency response systems, and we may be asked to participate and support all of these areas. So that's why it's important to know what these terms are and who functions within those groups. Other possible jurisdictions, communications, assets that are out there. We talked about CERT. One gentleman here brought up the CERT program. You know, those community emergency response teams, they've got to be able to communicate too. And quite often what do they normally use? What do they have out there? Family radios, GMRS radios, cell phones, Nextel radios, amateur radios, CBs. It's whatever they can get their hands on a lot of times. A lot of the states are trying to coordinate them, or trying to get them licensed as amateurs to give them a little bit more capability. That's a double-edged sword, though. You get them on the amateur band, they're talking on repeaters. Next thing you know, we've got some conflicts going on. We've got some issues where they may be using a repeater that may be better used for something else. They may be from out of the area, talking on a frequency that's in a band plan that's supposed to be used for something else. those different types of issues that you're going to run into out there. However, knowing that they're out there and knowing who's coming in is a key to your planning. So getting involved in those planning processes, going to talk to the volunteer coordinator, knowing which of these groups are coming in, that's going to help you get a better picture of what your overall communications system is going to look like, knowing that you have to. I would certainly rather know in advance these guys are coming, put them on my 205 and say this is where you're going to be, than to just let them dial something up and start talking. Yes, sir.
We're merging the CERT and RACES people together. We're having them work on joint ventures. We already have a communications trailer that we've outfitted for CERT and RACES.
That's great. That's good. Yeah, because when we're talking about CERT and RACES or other auxiliary AEC groups, we're really there is kind of a distinct difference between them. And it's interesting that you mentioned that you merge them. I'd like to talk to you more offline about how you're doing that, because these CERT groups are really serving a role out there. They're going out there and they're more operational than they are communicators. So they're using amateur radio to communicate to get their job done, whereas auxiliary communicators, communicating is our job. So it's kind of an interesting combination. It makes sense though. I mean, I'd rather have them integrated than to have them doing their own thing and just talking on whatever. Because a lot of them are licensed, but I think, as we all know, is because we're all generals in here or higher, that just because we're licensed doesn't necessarily mean that we know that we're not talking on simplex on repeater inputs, and we're not using high power mobiles on beacon frequencies and all kind of stuff like that. That's where you're going to run into this kind of stuff for sure. We licensed a bunch of our health department people, and that was kind of the first group we licensed was a learning process, we'll say. We'll just kind of leave it at that. It was a learning process. The second class, we did things a little differently. The second go around. First time we heard we heard some operational communications between a couple of people, and it was like, whoa, hold on a minute here. It got a little. They thought it was a little more than what it was supposed to be. So when we're talking about our CERT groups, we're talking about our National Guard, our CSTs. Do you guys have a CST here locally? I was blown away the first time I ever saw one of their setups.
We have one station at Fort Dix.
Yeah. What do they call it? A RERN or something like that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's incredible capabilities that they have on those vehicles. If you have not interfaced with your CST, highly recommend you do that to know what their capabilities are and what they have access to and what they're using out there. Your IMTs, regional, state, national IMTs, like what type of IMT that is. We have a region IMT within our Homeland Security region. You guys have an IMT here locally? Some places do, some places don't so much. It just kind of depends. It depends on how many incidents and things you have. And IMTs really, again, where does this fall back to? Kind of falls back to wildland fire again, where this is real big, where they have IMTs, statewide, regional, federal IMTs, where they call up folks from lots of different jurisdictions to come together to handle a specific incident, especially when we're getting up to a Type 1 team. We're talking about major incidents of significance, major fires, lots of people being evacuated, hurricanes, major issues we're talking about when we get into these Type 1 teams that they are prepared to handle. Our USAR and our SUSAR teams. Anybody participating in one of those, or at least familiar with them, know who the local contacts are? Again, they have their own communications arsenal of their own caches of repeaters, their own caches of radios. It's important to know what they're operating on, what they've got, what their capabilities are, and what their resources are out there. Okay, some other potential or possible communications assets. Your incident support teams, which falls within FEMA. That's basically their version of an IMT. They respond out to handle incidents. Usually when a USAR team goes out, an IST will go along. These are kind of the people that set up and support that team when they're out doing their thing. FCC FedTech, anybody ever worked with them? Worked with the FedTech group? You have? What circumstances was that?
Interference.
Interference. That's usually when you're going to have them come out. If you're getting interference on a radio system, especially if it's malicious or willful interference, is usually when they're going to come out.
We basically work with each other. Sometimes they call us, sometimes we call them.
Yeah, in my whole experience with radio, I've only ever dealt with FedTech once. We had somebody making Mayday calls on a radio channel.
We had that in Mercer County. We had a big incident back in the 80s where statewide police emergency network channel 2 was being interfered with, and it was fishing vessels. We used U.S. Coast Guard Boston, the FedTech from the FCC, and myself. We found them. And,
wow.
Being they were U.S. Registered vessels, they got some big fines.
No, I'm sure.
Right.
I'm sure they did. So the FedTech groups, these guys are usually going to come out. You're not going to usually see them unless you request them. You're not going to usually see them just out roaming around. They usually have stacks of complaints that they're dealing with. Any other response groups that are out there that you guys can think of?
I got the U.S. Coast Guard, the Medical Reserve Corps.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. The Medical Reserve Corps and the DMAT teams, the disaster medical teams.
The DMATs, they used to have a lot of radio capability. They've reduced a lot of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we saw after 9/11, a lot of those teams got really big. They bought all this gear and all this equipment and everything, and we've seen the same thing with ours. They got all of this stuff, and then it turned into we've got all this stuff, but how are we going to maintain it? How are we going to, we don't really have the funds to keep all this stuff going, sustain it, so they've reduced it back down to a more reasonable amount of equipment that they have out there. But the DMAT teams, knowing that they're out there, knowing that they're going to be, if they show up on your scene, they're going to need to communicate, and they're going to need spectrum as well. They're going to need to talk, for sure. So that's a good one to mention. Yeah, Coast Guard, you mentioned Coast Guard, the Coast Guard Auxiliary, is that what you mentioned?
Yes.
Yeah.
Civil Air Patrol.
Civil Air Patrol,
Yeah, the Red
Hospitals
Cross
and healthcare
also.
centers.
Red Cross, the Mars groups,
Mars Group.
all those different types of, what's that?
Saturn.
Saturn?
Yes.
Yep, that's the Salvation Army's
Salvation Army.
own little group that they have. Again, all of those groups are going to be using...
RRL also. Memory Relay League. Okay.
Yep. All of those different groups are going to be using auxiliary spectrum. They're going to be using those Part 97 bands, or needing to. So if you're the AEC manager, knowing who's coming in, that's going to be important.